In today's video, we are going to touch base on what a data type is, and we're going to take a look at some common data types and to see what they are. Let's get to it. If you're new here, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe below. And go ahead and click on that bell icon so you can get notified by my future uploads. Now, let's get into our topic. Now let's go into data types. Let's go ahead and break down this term even further. First, let's talk about what data is. Data is essentially all the information the user interacts with. When you're programming or when you're starting to work with some of these coding and programming languages, you will start to deal with some sort of data, some sort of information that you'll be using. And essentially what data type is those different forms that those information takes. And I'll show you what the different forms they are and the most common ones that you'll be seeing, which are these next set here. So there are a lot more data types than there are here. These are the most common ones that you'll see here and there. But with these ones, you'll be using them a lot throughout your whole development career. We'll talk about string, integers, float, booleans, nil/null, arrays, hash, and dates. And with these data types, they're mostly universally used in other languages, in other programming languages. So you'll be seeing some of these terms in other languages as well, but they might be called something different. So let's go ahead and break these down one by one. Now the first common one is called a string. A string is anything that is inside of these double or single quotes. And it doesn't matter what is in it. It doesn't matter if it's a symbol or a number. As long as it's inside of those quotation marks, it's considered a string. Usually strings are there to interpolate words and characters, but there's other ways you can use them as well. Integers are any whole numbers. And with these integers, you can use them with any sort of math. And that's another use case of why you would use integers. You can apply some sort of calculations to these integers. And they don't really matter how many numbers or how big of the number is. And those are all considered integers. Now, occasionally you would have to deal with floats in some shape or form. With floats, they are considered any decimal values that is after a certain decimal. If you have a decimal value, it's actually much more accurate if you're using a float. Because with an integer, if you have some sort of calculations, it actually won't round like you think it would. It actually would just cut it off and won't include the decimal. But with floats, you'll get a much more accurate number because of however many decimal places that you can have. And it really doesn't matter how far from the decimal it is, it's still all considered floats. In other languages, it might be called something else. It might break it down into either doubles, which means that there's two values after the decimals, but usually you would deal with some sort of a decimal value when you're dealing with data types. Our next one is pretty easy and simple, as binary. It's called a Boolean. And what Boolean is true and false. Notice that it's not a string of true and false because that's a different data type. This is actually without the string, and these are what makes up certain computer calculations. They either compile to either true or to be false. They're pretty much like yes and no. Is this something that would work inside of this program? Yes and no, true or false. Things like that. That's where a good use case of a Boolean would be. Now, this is a little bit complex because we don't really have something that represents this in our real world. But in the computer world, is something called nil and null. What nil and null is something that represents nothing, or something that's not there yet. So with nil and null, instead of saying 0, because 0 is technically an integer value, you can just say nil and null if something that doesn't exist for that particular case. And we'll see more examples of this. With these next couple, they're a little bit harder. And with this one is array. What array is you usually see in a box bracket like this, or items inside of a box bracket. Like here we have an array of fruits. And occasionally you'll see some classes be used with arrays and some of these other data types as well. And what an array is a collection of objects. So a collection of objects. In this case, this is a collection of strings. You can store a lot of things inside of arrays. In other languages, you may be limited to arrays of just a certain data types. But in other languages, you can have a mixed data type array. So you can put strings, integers, numbers, whatever that is needed there. So arrays are really good to help store a collection of data. Our next item is a hash. With a hash, it's usually denoted by these curly braces, or sometimes it's called objects, or used with this class of hash. In other languages, they call it something else, but essentially it's a key value pair, a key value pair. So inside of these curly braces, you have a key is what you would call an attribute, and then a value is the actual value of it. For example, for this particular hash, the key is the first name, the value is Bob. The key here is last name, and the value of that is Doe. So those are key value pairs. There's some sort of a attribute for the key, and then the actual value for it afterwards. You'll occasionally will be working with dates, but the thing about dates is time is very complex because it's always moving forward. And technically there's different formats of dates. As you can see, you can do year, month, day, or year, month, day, hours, minutes, and seconds, or nanoseconds, or even UTC time. It gets a lot of complex the more formats that you're dealing with. So just note, depending on what you're doing, you might want to simplify it with a specific date format. So you might not always use this nanosecond, but you may be using this first one here. So dates is a data type you'll be seeing a lot, but it really depends on which formatting it is. Now, those are the main data types. There are much more data types out there, and some of it is actually language-based. There's primitive data types in Java, and other data types inside of SQL and Ruby. And with those, you would need to use them depending on your use case, so when needed. And you're not going to use every single data type. Don't memorize all the data types that is available to you or that I show you. Just use and memorize the ones that you use the most, because you'll definitely be using strings and integers, and you will be dealing with Booleans in one way or the other. So memorize those ones, or at least these 8 here, and then with the other ones, you can reference them later. The next question here is, why even use data types? Technically, can we just all throw everything in a string and deal with it that way? Well, yes and no. The reason why we use data types is that it's actually easier to run logic. So if you see this number 4 here inside of a string, if I want to add a number to it, the computer thinks that it's a string versus another string. So technically, it won't really do the arithmetic. It will actually do something different. And that's not what we want. We actually want the correct calculations. And the other way you can do is that you can actually take the quotes off and turn it into an integer and then do the calculations, but that's just too many steps. So a better way to do it is to have everything in their own data type, in their own situations. The other thing is that it's actually much more readable. When you are looking at an object, for example, a hash, this is actually a much more readable way to look at a name, is inside of a string data type. And for age, it's actually better to use an integer because age is a numeric value. So it really depends on what type of data you're working with and the data type of it to match with that data. And also it helps keeps it broad. So technically you can have a bunch of more data types and break this down even more, but data types are actually a broad way to encapsulate a bunch of things together. Like anything inside of these quotes are considered strings, and numbers, you have a bunch of numbers, right? You have rational numbers, numeric numbers, or arithmetic numbers, but an integer is a type of number, a float is a type of decimal number. So you can actually broaden it out to those data types as well. And let me actually show you a use case with some of these data types. So let's say a site has users, which is normal. Facebook, YouTube, and almost majority of every website has some sort of a user base. And with these users, you have to have a way to store all these users. And we learned that an array is a good way to store a bunch of items, to store a bunch of objects. And here you can see that we are storing all the users inside an array and representing them with a key value pair. For this particular set of user, we just have their name, which is a string of Bob, and the age of the integer of 42. Now with that, that's actually a much more easier way to have your data and to work with your data, because we're using multiple types of data types to represent a single users or multiple users. So we can start to grab certain items from this array if we need to. If we need to grab everyone's age, there's a way to do that. If we need to grab all the users or how many users there are in this array, there's also a way to do that. So with this particular use case, there's a lot more functionality you can do with these data types. And that's one of the other reasons why we use data types, is the way that we are using these types of data and what we're using them for. So now, what do I do with this information? Well, I would actually explore a little bit more about data types. If there are any data types that confuse you, go ahead and look it up. Go ahead and look it up in your language or see what it is or the definition. See if that helps you with some examples as well. And that's what the next step you would be doing. I will be making future videos on arrays as well as hashes. And with that, I am going to have a bunch of examples with those lessons. Well, if you haven't already, go ahead and like, comment, and subscribe, and go ahead and click on the bell icon below so you'll be notified by my next video. See ya!